On our last day of school, my friends and I decided to celebrate by spending the evening at Jake's house. We wanted to cherish our final moments together before summer began. Jake's house was an old, two-story home on the outskirts of town, with a large backyard that bordered a dense forest. Over the years, we had spent countless evenings there, playing hide and seek and sharing ghost stories around a bonfire. This night was meant to be no different, or so we thought. The evening began joyfully. We played video games, roasted marshmallows, and laughed until our sides hurt. As the night deepened, Jake suggested we play one final game of hide and seek before it got too dark. The idea of playing in the dim light of dusk added an exciting, if eerie, thrill to the game. We set the boundaries, the house and the first few rows of trees in the forest. I was it, so I closed my eyes and began counting to 50 while my friends scattered to find their hiding spots. The cool evening air carried the faint hum of crickets and rustling leaves as the sun dipped below the horizon. When I finished counting, I opened my eyes and began my search. The house was eerily quiet as I moved from room to room, calling out for my friends. I found Emma first, crouched behind the couch, and Jack next, squeezed into the pantry. We laughed as they joined me in the search for Jake, who, as usual, had found the best hiding spot. After scouring every corner of the house without success, we ventured into the backyard. The first few rows of trees stood like silent sentinels, casting long shadows in the fading light. We called out for Jake, but there was no answer. Maybe he's hiding deeper in the forest, Emma suggested. I hesitated but nodded. Let's keep looking. We stepped cautiously into the woods, the dense canopy above swallowing what little light remained. The usual forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owl hoots, were strangely absent. The silence was unnerving, and our calls for Jake seemed swallowed by the oppressive stillness. Maybe he went back to the house, Emma said, her voice trembling slightly. Let's search a little longer, I replied, trying to mask my unease. As we moved further into the forest, a chilling sense of wrongness crept over us. The air grew colder, and the darkness seemed alive, pressing in around us. That's when we saw it, a shadowy figure moving between the trees. At first, we thought it was Jake trying to scare us, but as we stepped closer, we realized the figure was far too tall, too dark, to be our friend. Jake, is that you? Jack called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it glided between the trees with unnatural, jerky movements that made our skin crawl. A sudden, bone-chilling cold enveloped us, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Let's go back, Emma whispered urgently. We turned and began walking quickly toward the house, but the shadow followed, always at the edge of our vision. It grew larger, more menacing with each step. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, we were running. We burst out of the trees and into the backyard, the shadow vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. We didn't stop until we were inside the house, slamming and locking the doors behind us. Our breaths came in ragged gasps as we collapsed onto the living room floor. Where's Jake? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Panic set in as we searched the house again, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Fear clutched at our hearts as we realized he was still out there, alone in the dark. We decided to call Jake's parents and the police, hoping they could help us find him. Every minute felt like an hour as we huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak of the old house. When the police arrived, they began their search, combing through the forest with flashlights and dogs. We watched from the window, our hearts heavy with guilt and fear. After what felt like an eternity, they found Jake. He was sitting at the base of a large tree, unharmed but visibly shaken. When they brought him back to the house, he couldn't remember how he'd gotten there or why he hadn't responded to our calls. The only thing he could recall was an overwhelming feeling of dread and the distinct sensation of being watched. The police found no trace of the shadowy figure we had seen. They assured us it was likely just our imaginations, heightened by the dim light and the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But we knew what we had seen. That dark shadow wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of our imagination. It was real. For weeks, the memory of that figure haunted us, casting a pall over our summer. Jake was never the same after that night. He became quieter, more withdrawn, as if the forest had taken a part of him that he could never get back. And sometimes, late at night, I would think about the shadow and wonder if it was still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far into the woods. The last day of school is always a bittersweet moment, filled with excitement for the summer ahead, but tinged with sadness at leaving friends behind, even if only for a few months. For my friends and me, it also marked a time for adventure. That year, we decided to do something bold, something we had talked about for years but never dared to attempt. We planned to explore the old abandoned school at the edge of town, a place that had been the source of countless ghost stories and urban legends. The school had been closed for years, left to decay and be reclaimed by nature. Stories about it were passed down from one generation of students to the next. Tales of ghost sightings, mysterious whispers, and strange occurrences. We had always dismissed them as exaggerated myths, but on the last day of 8th grade, our curiosity got the better of us. We decided to see for ourselves if the stories were true. It was late afternoon when we finally gathered the courage to set off. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the deserted building. The school loomed before us, its windows shattered and doors hanging askew. The rusted gate groaned as we pushed it open, the sound echoing in the eerie stillness. "Are we really doing this?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with nervous excitement. "Yeah, we are," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "It's now or never." We stepped inside, the temperature dropping instantly. The air was heavy with the smell of mold and decay. The hallways were lined with rusting lockers, their doors ajar, revealing forgotten textbooks and broken pencils. Our flashlights sliced through the gloom, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Every creak of the old structure made us jump, yet there was an undeniable thrill in the exploration, a sense of adventure mixed with fear. We wandered cautiously, peering into classrooms filled with broken desks and dusty chalkboards. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our footsteps and the occasional drip of water from somewhere deep in the building. It was eerie, but nothing overtly terrifying, at least not yet. As we ventured deeper into the school, we came upon a narrow staircase leading to the basement. The stairs descended into complete darkness, and a sense of unease settled over us. None of us wanted to admit how scared we were, so we pressed on, our curiosity outweighing our fear. The basement was far worse than the upper floors. The air was thick and musty, making it hard to breathe. Our flashlights revealed strange symbols drawn on the walls, symbols none of us could recognize. Old furniture was piled haphazardly, creating an obstacle course we had to carefully navigate. The floorboards creaked ominously beneath our feet as we moved further in. In the far corner of the basement, we found a door that was slightly ajar. We exchanged uneasy glances before pushing it open. Inside was a small room filled with old, yellowed papers and broken chairs. At the center of the room stood a circle of candles, long extinguished but still upright. The sight sent chills down my spine. "What is this?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, barely audible, "but I don't like it." As we examined the room, a noise broke the silence. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper. We froze, straining to hear. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and seemed to come from all around us. Panic gripped us as we realized we were no longer alone. "Let's get out of here," I whispered urgently. We hurried back up the stairs, our breaths quick and shallow. But the school seemed unwilling to let us go. As we entered the main hallway, we stopped dead in our tracks. At the far end of the corridor stood a dark figure. It was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the shadows. "Do you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. We all nodded, too terrified to speak. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching us. Slowly, we backed away, our flashlights trembling in our hands. When we turned a corner, we broke into a full sprint, desperate to escape the building's suffocating grip. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, their lengths distorted in the dim light. Whispers followed us, growing louder, joined by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. My heart pounded as fear consumed me, the air thick with dread. It felt as if the school itself were alive, determined to keep us trapped. Finally, we burst through the front doors and into the cool evening air. We didn't stop running until we were far from the building, collapsing onto the grass in exhaustion. The relief of being outside, away from the oppressive atmosphere, was overwhelming. "What was that?" Lily asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing with fear and confusion. "But I'm never going back there." We made a pact to keep our adventure a secret, unwilling to relive the terror of that night by speaking of it. The abandoned school was eventually demolished and replaced with a new building, but the memory of that day stayed with us, vivid and unshakable. To this day, I still try to make sense of what we experienced. The whispers, the symbols, the dark figure. Feels like a bad dream, but we know it was real. We were there. We felt the fear. It started with little things. I'd see the same person watching me from a distance, but I brushed it off as paranoia. Everyone has moments like that, don't they? Where a stranger's glance lingers a second too long, or shadows feel like they're closing in. I convinced myself it was nothing, but everything changed on the last day of school. What should have been a day of celebration transformed into a nightmare I will never forget. My friends and I were buzzing with excitement as we walked home together, discussing our summer plans. The streets were alive with energy. Students laughing, parents chatting, teachers waving goodbye. Felt like the perfect end to the school year. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and for a moment, the world seemed untouched by anything dark or sinister. That was when I first noticed him. He was standing near the school gate, a man in his late 30s, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. At first glance, he didn't look out of place. Just another parent waiting to pick up their child. But as we walked by, I felt it. His eyes were on me. A cold sensation crept up my spine, like a warning I couldn't explain. I tried to shake it off, forcing myself to focus on my friends and their chatter. We had planned to spend the afternoon at the local park, soaking up the sunshine and reveling in our newfound freedom. When we arrived, we found the perfect spot under a large oak tree. We laughed, played games, and let the hours slip by, the memory of the man by the gate fading into the background. It wasn't until I went to buy ice cream from a nearby stand that I saw him again. He was standing near the park entrance, partially hidden by a tree, his eyes fixed on me. My heart skipped a beat. It had to be a coincidence, I told myself. There was no way he was following me. But the unease clawed at me, growing with every second. I hurried back to my friends, trying to act like everything was normal. We ate our ice cream, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I scanned the park, searching the faces in the crowd. He was gone. For a moment, I felt relief, but it was fleeting. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the park began to empty, we decided it was time to head home. The lively sounds of the day gave way to the stillness of the evening. I walked with my friend Emily, our conversation drifting to our summer plans. Halfway home, I saw him again. He was on the opposite side of the street, leaning against a lamppost, his gaze locked on us. My heart pounded in my chest. "Emily," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that guy over there?" She glanced over, frowning. "Yeah. What about him?" "He's been following me all day," I said, my voice trembling. "I saw him at school, then at the park, and now here." Emily's eyes widened. "That's creepy. We should go to your place and tell your parents." We quickened our pace, the air between us charged with fear. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him start to follow us, his steps slow and deliberate. By the time we reached my house, my hands were shaking. We rushed inside, locking the door behind us. I told my parents everything. They called the police and officers arrived quickly. But by the time they searched the neighborhood, the man was gone. They took my statement and assured me they would patrol the area, but their words did little to ease my fear. That night, sleep was impossible. Every noise, Every creak of the house sent me into a panic. I kept seeing his face in my mind, those cold, unblinking eyes. The fear was suffocating. Over the next few days, the police increased their patrols, but there was no sign of the man. My friends tried to support me, walking with me and checking in, but the fear never left. I felt like I was always being watched, a constant shadow looming over me. One evening, desperate to clear my head, I decided to go for a walk. The summer night was warm, the streets quiet. I stayed close to home, my senses on high alert. As I turned a corner, my breath caught. He was there, standing under a streetlight, his face partially obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, the sound of his footsteps echoing behind me. They quickened, matching my pace. My heart thundered in my chest as I darted into a narrow alley, hoping to lose him. The alley was dark, the walls closing in. Realizing I was trapped, I ducked behind a dumpster, my breath coming in short gasps. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small as possible. The footsteps stopped. I heard him breathing slow, steady. Then, his voice, low and menacing. "You can't hide forever." Fear gripped me like a vice. My eyes darted around, landing on a broken bottle on the ground. My hands trembled as I picked it up, clutching it tightly. I waited, every nerve in my body screaming. The footsteps started again, moving away. I didn't wait. When I was sure he was gone, I bolted, running as fast as I could back home. When I told my parents, they called the police again. This time, the officers took my fear seriously. They searched the area but found nothing. The days that followed were tense. My parents installed security cameras, and I carried pepper spray everywhere. But the fear lingered, a constant weight. Then, one evening, the doorbell rang. My dad answered it, and I heard him talking to someone. My stomach twisted with dread. When he called me to the door, my worst fear was realized. It was him. "Hello," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "I'm your new neighbor." He smiled, but his eyes were cold.